On the 20th of August, 1336, Philip VI of France gave his final answer. He intends to invade England and Scotland immediately. 5 months ago, Pope Benedict had informed the French king that he no longer intended to call the crusade, allowing him to move some 230 ships from Marseille to the coast of Normandy. There, his fleet would harry the Channel coast, first in Suffolk, and then venture as far as the Isle of Wight. For the next 116 years, the kings of England would fight their French counterparts for the throne of France, although it would be a further 347 for them to drop their claim. For many, this was the beginning of the so-called 100 Years' War, while for others, it's a continuation of the hostilities which have been present since 1066, the Norman invasion. The 100 Years' War is steeped in legend, with great battles such as Crecy or Orleans being two of the most known. It's also highly contentious. From an English perspective, it was a victory after victory, from Crecy to Poitiers, Poitiers to Agincourt, while French people, they see Joan of Arc and the Battle of Castillon as the killing blows to an aberrant English empire. And from a wider perspective, however, the 100 Years' War was little more than a continuation of the conflicts which would rage on until the 19th century. What distinguishes the 100 Years' War from the wars of Richard and John, and was this really a French civil war? Before we go on, I'd like to state that the 100 Years' War was characterised by English military success, but almost complete failure on the political front. Of course, this is a generalisation, and there were exceptions, such as cooperation between English and Burgundians. But despite military successes, the English remained on the back foot. In order to gain a better perspective, let's have a look at the political situation in France. To the south, the traditional power of Toulouse and Foix had largely been degraded by the Albigensian Crusade, and while the northern and eastern regions fell largely under the sway of the Dukes of Burgundy, who themselves had a claim to the French throne. Meanwhile, Normandy and Flanders were controlled largely by royalist forces, and indeed the king's family, although their cities were more amenable to England, largely due to the wool imports. Despite this, English control of Aquitaine and Brittany threatened the royal fiefs of the Loire Valley. Powerful magnates across France would have a varied, but nonetheless significant, impact across the period, with specific events such as the assassination of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, being watersheds. Principally, the difference between the 100 Years' War and the numerous wars fought before was Edward III's claiming of the French throne when hostilities commenced. In 1340, he claimed to be the legitimate ruler of France, being the closest living relative of the previous monarch, although many within France denied this claim, preferring their own Philippe of Valois, who was next in line according to Salic law, which discounts all female inheritance. Every war fought with France until 1453 would have the direct, stated goal of securing the French throne. Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, would, in 1360, agree to renounce this claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty of Aquitaine and Calais, in exchange for both King John II and his son Philippe the Bold. This stipulation was promptly ignored by the Parliament, a French name for their primary legal courts, kind of like the American Supreme Court, and began accepting suits and issuing verdicts from Edward's possessions. The war would begin again many years later, prompted by the Castilian Civil War, and Edward would once again claim the French throne. Henry V, perhaps the most militarily successful of these monarchs, was proclaimed heir to the French throne after conquering most of northern France, and his son, creatively named Henry, was crowned the King of France in Notre Dame in 1431. Militarily, the much smaller and poorer English monarchy was able to match and in most cases defeat the French due to tactical and strategic brilliance, along with a steady stream of good fortune, although this was promptly turned around by Joan of Arc, and England was for the most part pushed from the continent. This interpretation is the general one, accepted by most people today. However, it's undermined if you consider that Henry VIII's invasion is not included despite its stated goal. Henry VIII would invade France a number of times during his reign, first in 1512 under his father, and then more famously in the 1540s and 50s. Proclaimed as King of France by the Pope, provided he could repeat the actions of his predecessors, he would have as strong a claim to the kingdom as any other. It's clear then that historians should include this within the umbrella term that is the 100 Years' War, provided the explanation of English claims to the French throne is the qualifying factor. An alternative, and in my eyes, and the eyes of a number of modern historians such as Anne Curry, is that the cause of the war was the absence and then re-establishment of politically centralising French throne. This would lend more credence to the idea that the cause of war was the attempted revocation of Gascony, which would make it similar to the conflict fought between the kings of France and the earlier Angevins. Indeed, this is supported by the chronology of events, as although the English claim to the French throne was only made in 1340, the actual date of the disputed succession was over a decade prior, in 1328. Following the commencement of hostilities, the Parisian Parliament declared Edward in default, and as such he should return the fief of Poitiers in south-central France, providing the King of France a cause for war and betraying that the general trend of political centralisation within France, where courts in Paris attempted to overrule the local institutions such as the Bordeaux Parlement. Had Edward III's true aim been to claim the French throne, he surely would have secured that concession from the king when he was in captivity, rather than rest on his laurels and obtain sole de jure legal authority over his continental possessions. Resistance to this centralisation is, in my mind, what truly characterises this period, more so than any other specific factor, although there's very little reason for the period to be once again called the 100 Years' War. There were significant periods of peace between 1360 and 69, as well as again between 1389 and 1415. Similarities between the first two Edwardian wars and then the second Lancastrian period go so far as the claim to the French throne, the fact that war took place between England and France, and that war took place in France. It's quite telling that historians need to split the war into an Edwardian and Lancastrian phase, that for the purposes of classifying a military conflict, this term perhaps causes more issues than it solves. Was the 100 Years' War a French civil war? A civil war is a violent conflict within a country fought by organised groups that aim to take power at the centre or in a region, or to change government policies. And by this definition, we can safely say that the 100 Years' War was indeed a civil war, where various French nobles sought to change government policy of centralisation, and the most powerful of them, who also happened to be the King of England, also wished to take power over France. This is the claim to the French throne. It was with this definition, however, that the term 100 Years' War becomes once again useful, as it allows historians to group a number of wars and conflicts in which near constant warfare had a similar political aim. Therefore, the 100 Years' War is certainly a useful term, although not for the reason it's used in popular culture. It characterises what is in reality a civil war between the Valois court party and an English country party, with various magnates across France switching sides more readily than the Italian government in a world war. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe. I have been Thomo, and this has been my talk.